this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here today with Natalie Webb, and we're going to deep dive into her family history. So, welcome, Natalie. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm very excited. Very
Great.
excited.
That's good. That's good. Um, so, before we really get into it, Webb obviously isn't an Italian name, so
It is not.
I'm assuming that's your married name.
No, actually, it's not that either. It is my original name. My mother's family is fully Italian, or now in the days of DNA, as Italian as one can be, because Italian's always mixed up with Greek and a lot of Mediterranean DNA. My father's family. Um, on my father's side, his mother was Italian, and she married an Englishman. He was raised in a very Italian household because his maternal grandmother lived with them and taught him Italian. He spoke Italian better than anyone else in the family. And we joke that the only thing that really got passed down from the English was the name, because we consider ourselves really an Italian family, but you're not the first to say that. It's interesting that about the only part of my English and a little Irish heritage that survived has been the name. Um, everything else is mostly Italian.
Well, and that's interesting too, especially since um, when you're researching in America, it's hard because the women change their names, but in Italy,
Yes,
they keep their
yes,
maiden names,
yes,
which does
yes.
help a lot.
Yes, I noticed that actually first when I was looking at passenger manifests coming over, because
Mhm.
my family came over on my mother's side. They came over around the turn of the century, depending on the individual persons, somewhere between maybe the 1890s to 1905, 1906. And the men tended to come over first and then send for the women and children. And so I would be looking for the women under their married names and
Mhm.
not finding them, and then when I started to realize that in other parts of the world they use their maiden names for official business like this, it became a little easier, you know.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and yeah, it took me a little while to figure that out too. I never really realized it, and then, like you said, with my father's mom, um, I figured it out because the kids were Sorrentino and she was Piomalo, and it's
yeah.
like, well, this is strange. But the interesting thing about my mom's family is my both my grandparents' last name was Nicoletti, although they weren't
Oh.
related.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Yes.
that was even confusing for me too. But a, a funny story for my family where I don't know if it was a salesman or something came to the door and he was asking my grandmother her maiden name and she kept saying Nicoletti and he thought she didn't understand,
She didn't understand the question.
but she knew what he
Yes.
was saying.
Yes. Yes.
That
Definitely. Well,
was her name.
your family, like I said before that I had listened to your podcasts. Your family's from Brooklyn, because my family's from Brooklyn,
My family's from Queens,
Queens. Okay,
so right
so
next
you know
door.
the area.
Yeah,
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 I
yeah.
I was very lucky in that most of my family came over from Italy, and I like to say they literally got off the boat and sat down and didn't move, because just about everyone in my family, uh, this is we've been here 3, 4 generations, really hasn't moved out of the New York metro area, including myself. I'm in New Jersey, and that makes it easy in a way, because I can take the train into the city and go to the archives, and most of my family is there. Um, it also makes it nice because if I so chose, I could go to one of the houses that my family had owned and see where my great grandmother lived when she got here, and the house is still standing, which is always interesting. So having everything very accessible is really nice. I'm lucky
Yeah.
in that way.
Yeah. So where did they come from in Italy?
Um, my of the four Italian branches, most of them came from the South. My my mother's family came from my mother's maternal family came from Piano di Sorrento, which is just south of Naples.
Hmm.
My father's Italian side came from Casa di Tirrene, which is more towards Amalfi Coast, a little bit further south than that. um, my mother's maternal line is very interesting because there's an interesting story there in which my mother's paternal grandmother was Anna Lisbona. Lisbona was her maiden name. And we always thought Lisbona, Lisbon, there was a family story before DNA became testing became popular that maybe she was Spanish. um, and her father was a merchant. This, as the story went, her father was a merchant seaman. Her mother died in childbirth, so we have this sailor with a baby, and he can't obviously take her on the boat, so he put her in an Italian convent. So whether or not she was Spanish or Italian, she was raised Italian. And then when she was of marrying age, her father arranged for her to marry someone else who was working on one of the ships with him. And the fellow came to Brooklyn and settled down and sent for my grandmother, and she came over and met him and married him, and they had a million kids. Um, but we don't know what part of Italy she came from because Lisbona is a very hard name to track in Italy. I've seen one or two of them and haven't really had much of a biological connection. And the first information I have, the first true document I have of her is the birth of her first child in Brooklyn. So I know she was here by 1889 because that's when her first kid was born.
Hmm.
But I have no idea where in Italy she comes from, and it's interesting. I love the mysteries. Solving the mysteries are
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
favorite part of genealogy, you know.
Yeah, me too. And when you finally solve it, it's fantastic. So they came
Yes.
very, very early then.
They did. They did. The last of my immigrant family came over. That generation came over in 1906. Um, the earliest, like I said, my mother's paternal grandmother was here as of 1889. I'm assuming her husband, if any part of that story is true, her husband was here a little bit before her. Um, the problem is that looking up immigration records from that time, if you've seen a naturalization record or an immigration record, there's really not much to it. So her husband, my paternal great grandfather's name was Frank Russo. And I mean, it's a really common name, or
Mhm.
Francesco Russo. There's a lot of them. And if you look at the passenger manifest, it's just literally a name and how many pieces of baggage you had, what city you got on in, and what port you got off at. So if you look at later passenger manifest, it goes into much more detail about what person you're looking to see and what their address is and who you're traveling with, but there's not much information in the older documents, so it makes it more of a mystery, and a little harder to solve.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, so you said they came to Brooklyn. Do you know
They did.
why they came and what did they when they got here? What did they do?
Um, I believe they came just for a better life. Southern Italy during that time was war, and it seemed like they were part of that mass exodus, that diaspora that was coming over. My mother's maternal side, her I'm sorry, her paternal grandfather was a grocer. He was a fruit vendor,
Hmm.
and he had a cart over in Brooklyn. Just I think it's in the north of Brooklyn. There's that one section where all the fruit vendors kind of gathered, and he worked there. They moved around constantly all over Brooklyn. They probably moved, once a year for about 20, 30 years. I mean, they'd never earned property, you know. On my mother's maternal side, um, they all worked in factories. My mother's paternal grandfather, uh, maternal grandfather, sorry, died very early. He died in his 30s. He had been in the country for about 6 or 7 years. Uh, his wife, my great grandmother, had six small children. Her youngest was maybe 6 months old, um, and she worked in a factory, to support her kids. And it really wasn't a career per se, it was just a way of making money. My grandmother and all her sisters also, they were seamstresses, and one of my great aunts worked in a factory in the 30s and 40s making pens. So she
Hmm.
would always come back um, with these like novelty pens, and there would be boxes of them around the house, and it was less about coming over, to have a certain career, and more about just getting out of Italy and coming to the US. um yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, it was very tough back there, but at least, back then there was, you know, still factories in New York. My wife and I were talking the other day. We still remember the garment district when they
Yes.
used to
Oh,
roll
yes.
the carts with the dresses and everything down the
Yes.
street in Midtown Manhattan.
Yes. Yes, exactly. It New York has changed a lot. You don't have a lot of that, uh those regions like you used to,
Hmm.
like there's the diamond district and the garment district and the flower district, and it's all starting to meld now into one, and Brooklyn even more so. you know um the Brooklyn that I remember uh visiting as a kid is really not there anymore. you know
No.
um it's a little crazy. My family had uh, a big house, or my extended family, after World War II. My grandmother and some of her brothers and sisters uh, went in on a house all together in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn, which is just north of Coney Island, right off of McDonald Avenue. And it was this big old house, like 7, 8 bedrooms, and um, full backyard and everything. And they were supporting my great grandmother, who had been retired at that point. But it became like the family compound, where everybody, you had like three sisters and their husbands all living there. And then as they had kids and the kids grew up and moved out, everybody would come back for holidays. And I we had the houses in the family up until about 20 years ago, when my grandmother, God bless her, died at 103.
Wow.
So yeah,
Okay.
the,
Okay.
the genes on my mother's side are really pretty good.
Nice.
um, and the nice thing about having a house like that, in which several generations grew up in, is that they didn't throw anything out. So I have close to 1,000 photos of
Wow.
my family
Yeah.
from the 20s up to the I don't know, the turn of the 21st century. And I have my great grandmother's original naturalization paperwork, because no one ever threw it out. you know um upstairs in my attic is actually the steamer trunk that my great grandparents used, or my great grandmother used, when she came over to this country,
Wow.
which is
That's
yeah.
unbelievable.
When they finally sold the house, I was like, that's the one thing I want. Just I want
Mm.
that steamer trunk, because uh, these things are one of a kind, and you have that history of the shared family experience from generation to generation. Um, but yeah, they lived in Brooklyn, and that was the first piece of property that my family owned. After the Second World War, my uncles had the GI Bill that helped them buy a house. I think the house at that time was $4,000.
Mm.
Um, and
It's
I
probably 4 million now.
I don't want to tell you what they sold it for, but yeah, it's they made a great return on their investment. Um, but it's having that like being part of that neighborhood and being part of that extended family and having that history is interesting, you know, and I think it's what made me get into genealogy in the first place. Is you know, you sit around the as a kid, you sit around the table during a holiday and you listen to everybody tell the stories of what happened way back when, and oh, you remember this guy and when he had this fight with this other guy, and you know, when now they're drinking buddies, and you know, and all this kind of stuff. And it those stories were really what sparked my interest in genealogy in the first place, you know.
Yeah, and that's so great that everything was saved. I know, I'm sure, because my paternal grandparents lived with my aunt and uncle in Whitestone,
Hmm.
and I'm sure that my cousin, when she moved to Florida, probably had whatever my grandmother had,
Hmm.
because I think my grandmother probably saved a lot. Because I didn't know until just recently, just the last few years, that she was corresponding with Italy from the
Hmm.
20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s
Hmm.
because her whole family was there. So
Hmm.
I'm sure that she must have had correspondence from Italy saved, that my aunt saved. And when my cousin passed away, when they went into the garage, we were in Florida at the time, everything
Mm.
was just like, got wet and
Yeah.
molded and
Yeah.
just, whatever. If there was anything, it was all lost.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure she must have saved it because the when I met my cousins in Italy, they saved stuff that she sent.
Yes.
So
Yes.
she must have had stuff saved. So that's great. Well, you have to send me a picture of that steamer trunk. I want
Oh yes,
need to see
definitely.
that.
Definitely.
That's just
It's
like
it's old and it's extremely beat up, but
it's unbelievable.
it's great. It was used for storage in you know, they had in Brooklyn at the time, the kitchen was always in the basement.
Mhm.
So we
Yes, of
had
course.
you know, and they had this back cellar room that got no heat, and they kept all of their cans and boxes and groceries and everything in there. And it was really just in there for decades with just stuff in it, you know. And
Mhm.
we, when I was about 15, 16, I it was the first time I had gotten interested in genealogy because I had it for a while and then I dropped it and I came back to it. Um, and so when people would be sitting around telling their stories, I'd have my little notebook out, or one of those, I still have it. You go to Barnes and Noble and you get those, you know, my family history books
Mhm.
that have all the entries where you can put information in. And my grandparents would help me fill it out, and every once in a while they'd go in the back and go in the steamer trunk, and there'd be like a picture, or you know, I don't know, like a little something, something from somebody's wedding, you know, like a little gift from somebody's
Mhm.
wedding or something. And they'd be like, "Oh, this is, you know, so and so's cousin from whatever day." And um, so the steamer trunk was always in my mind. That was like a connection, one of the connections to my family actually coming here. Because I mean, the trunk itself started out in Italy, and now it's in the U.S. And yeah, I will definitely send you a picture.
Oh,
It's cool. It's
yeah,
definitely
I
cool.
bet. I bet. I wish I had asked my grandparents more questions. Especially, well, my two grandfathers, my father's father died when I was only a couple of months old, and my mom's grandfather, he mostly only spoke Italian, but I used to sit there
Mm,
and play cards with my grandmother, and I never thought
mhm,
to ask her, all of these questions and why they came. I mean, I know why my mom's parents came, and that was because um, my grandfather had served in the Libyan War in, I
mm,
think, 1911 or whenever it was, 1908, 1911, something like that. and my grandmother had a young child, and World War I was breaking out,
Mhm.
and she said, "You fought in one war, you're not going to fight in another one."
Ah,
But I
okay.
think they had planned to go back.
Uh-huh.
But then
Mhm.
they started having kids, and
Yes,
my
you get
grandmother's
settled.
brother was here, and
Yeah.
that was that. They
Yeah.
never did go back. My my dad's mom, well, my dad's parents, I don't have any clue. The only thing that my cousin and I can figure out was that her aunt had come first in 1905,
Mhm.
and she must have said, "Come." And my husband,
Yes.
apparently
Yes.
they had some cash. He was an
Mhm.
entrepreneur of sorts, and they must have said, "We'll help you start a business or something like that." And I
Right.
say that because they had a business behind me in the 20s. So that's the only thing I could figure, because nobody else in my grandmother's family, uh, or my grandfather, except for his brother, came
Mhm.
to America.
Huh.
Everybody else stayed in Italy.
Huh, that's interesting. So
Yeah.
my entire family, I mean, sisters, one brother would come over, and then sisters would follow with their husbands, and more brothers would come over, and eventually the parents would come over. And I mean, I I have very few relatives. Well, now I'm sure I have a lot because generations
Yeah,
go
yeah,
by
yeah,
and they
yeah.
have kids and everything. But I have very few back in Italy now. In fact, among the pictures that I inherited are some Christmas cards from you know, the ones with the pictures on them. They take pictures of their kids and they send out the Christmas cards in Italian. Um, just saying, Merry Christmas to my grandmother from, these people. And I'm like, well, who the hell are these people? you know? Some of this I'm still trying to figure out. Um, we had one interesting story where one of my great grandmother's brothers came to New York. Um, and then went back to Italy, but he went back very suddenly. And the mystery is what happened to make him go back. Because as a kid, listening to my father tell this story, what what he would say is, "Oh my God, he must have seen something that he shouldn't have seen because he left a grave here. He had a grave here, and then he went back to Italy and left the empty grave." And in my child's mind, I was thinking, "Oh, maybe they had like a fake funeral and they faked his death and all this stuff." And it turned out that my father exaggerates a lot. But the my great uncle in question came over with the rest of his family. In fact, he was the first one here, and then his sisters followed him over. Um, and he sent for a wife, got married, worked in a candy store. The grave that he bought was actually a six-person plot in St. John's, which is in Brooklyn, one of the big Italian cemeteries. And one of their brothers had died very early, so they bought the plot for six and then buried him at the time. And then it was very sudden. He just seemed to pick up and go back to Italy within a week, and no one knew why. Or if anyone knew why, they're not telling. Let's put they weren't telling. But the so-called grave that he left really was just that he paid for the plot. So I have information. I actually have some of the documentation for the plot because again, they didn't throw anything out. With his like that he was the original owner of the plot and he paid the money for it and all of this. Um, I haven't found many records for people going back to Italy. Like we have all the passenger manifests for people coming to the US, but I don't know if it's something that you've been able to find, but I haven't had much luck looking for information of for people that are going the other way, you
Yeah,
know.
I found one or two from my paternal uh grandmother's family. And I think they came, they didn't come to stay, they just came for some kind of visit or something like that. So
Right.
it was, but it was, I guess, in the maybe the 40s or 50s or something like that. And,
Right.
it's my grandmother's family is very interesting in that respect. Again, because of the fact that nobody came.
Hmm.
But, both of her parents came from relatively wealthy families.
Hmm.
So there was no reason for them to come.
Hmm.
Right. So that's why
Right.
eh, nobody has there's nobody to ask anymore, you know, uh, well, my father's brothers and sisters are all gone. And when I started this, my aunt really wasn't in the condition to ask. And I don't know if she would
Right.
have known anyway.
Right.
Um, but what shocks me is I didn't think to ask because I was young, and nobody, nobody ever mentioned why, you know?
Yeah. Yes.
So and I'm sure, like even my cousin that lived with my grandmother, when I asked her about it, and I said, when I found my great grandfather and I found out who he married, I asked her and I said, "Do you know this name?" She said, "Oh, sure, of course, that's grandma's. That's her mother." I
Hmm.
said, "Well, did you know that the family that she comes from, how, you know?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, she used to tell us that one they had an ancestor that was an admiral and another one was a saint." And I said, "Yeah, but
Hmm.
it's more than that. It's a lot more than that."
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I speculate with my wife all the time, and she says, "Well, maybe they." I said, "Well, my aunt that was my godmother, my father's oldest sister."
Yeah. Hmm.
I said she was born there, so she had to know her grandfather, of course.
Yes. Yes.
They lived in the same town. They lived in Circola outside of Naples. I said she wasn't that young when she came. She was, I guess, maybe 7 or 8. I said she had to have some memories
Right.
of there,
Right.
but nobody ever really talked about it. And like I said, I didn't think to ask.
Yeah.
So now, have you been back to any of the towns in Italy?
I have not, and I want to go,
Oh, you have to go.
which
You
I
have to
do. I
go.
really do. And I want to I'm thinking of sometime maybe in the 5-year plan, taking one of those, either a genealogical trip or take someone with me who can uh, have access to the records. And because if I want to go, I want to make it a research trip,
Mhm. Yeah.
and my Italian is limited. I can read more than I can speak, but I rely heavily on Google Translate. So
Yeah, me
if
too.
I'm, so if I'm, I have visions of being in this like little town in Piano di Sorrento and in like somebody's basement looking up files and with no internet connection. So how am I going to read anything if I can't go through Google Translate? So I would like to definitely do it, which is interesting because when I was young, I had uh, some of my aunts and my great aunts used to travel back, and we were just so steeped in talking about Italy, and they would talk Italian, and it was just such a regular family thing. I'm like, Italy, who would want to go there? There's so much more exciting places to go to, and when I was younger, and doing more traveling, before I settled down, Italy just wasn't on my radar. And once I restarted my genealogical research, all of a sudden it is,
Mm.
and I definitely want to go back, and do some of that research there.
Yeah, and when you get to the towns, I mean, there's no place more beautiful in Italy than
I'm
ever been to,
sure.
and I've been to a
Hmm.
lot of places. Um, but it's you just you feel at home when you get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know that's a difference than going to other places. You get there and you feel like I belong here.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
that's what makes it so interesting. But uh, you definitely, if you talk to Letizia that helped me with my trip,
Hmm.
they did a great job. And I know plenty of people over there now, more people than I ever thought I would know in a million
I'm
years.
sure.
so
I'm sure.
so uh, we could help you out. I mean, my dad's family, the Sorrentino family,
Hmm.
obviously they have some connection to Sorrento.
Yes.
Um, but I always thought that they were from Naples, and his, I guess my third great grandparents, I guess it was, they were from Nocera, Superiore,
Hmm.
so near Naples.
Hmm.
Uh, and then they went someplace else, and then eventually they wound up in Naples. And his family, my second great grandfather, my second no, my great grandfather, he was um, he was an attorney
Hmm.
in Naples, and I found a newspaper clipping from New Jersey, of all places, that when his wife passed away, when my great grandmother passed away, it said that he was a Supreme Court justice in Italy.
Wow.
But I haven't been able to like confirm that.
Right.
I'm sure it's
Right.
true because it probably would have been in the paper, and I'm sure my grandfather knew that's why it said that. Um, and I think he became an attorney. Either he was studying to be an attorney, and he met my great grandmother because her family were all attorneys,
Hmm.
and they had like a 30-page marriage document.
Wow. Everybody wanted to put their 2 cents in.
It's like this ridiculous. I never saw anything like this, and it's got everything in there. Um, and my uh, great grandfather's father was a pharmacist.
Hmm.
So, like in the 1850s or something like that, 1840s.
Right.
Um, so, quite a big difference from my mom's family, who were they were farmers from
Yeah.
Torito Bari, and farmers for generations and generations. I mean, at least as far back as I could find. I mean, the most amazing thing that I found there was, as I was going through all the records, I finally found somebody who was like I think he was like a forest ranger or something like that. And I was
Hmm.
like, oh boy, somebody who wasn't a seamstress or a
Yes.
farmer. This is fantastic. That's like,
Yes. Yes. Mine were all fishermen.
oh,
We have
okay.
Piano di Sorrento is right on the
Right on the,
water,
yeah,
so we had a lot of fishermen. Although you talk about people traveling around Italy, my maternal great grandfather um, was actually his father. So my second great grandfather was born in Bari. He was Barese, and my second great grandmother as well. And then they moved. They had a few children in Bari. Then they moved for some reason, and I really don't know why, but they moved to Rome, Civitavecchia in Rome,
mm,
and had my great grandfather while they were living there, and then moved to Piano di Sorrento, which I'm assuming where he was raised and where he met my great grandmother. Um, but my second great grandfather, at least before he moved from Bari, was a telegraph operator. Um,
ah,
it had just been, this was in the 1850s, when telegraphs were, I guess, in their infancy. Um, so I'm still trying to work out why they traveled, because I mean Bari is on the eastern coast, and then they went
yeah,
to Rome on the west coast, and then went south. So it's something I haven't been able to figure out yet. I don't know, it's maybe because he had that skill that he was able to move around, and uh once you know how to interpret the telegraph code, I guess you can go anywhere you want.
yeah,
um,
yeah,
but it was interesting to me to see them travel throughout my second great grandfather's lifetime, as opposed to my mother's maternal side, where they literally were in the same town for generations and nobody moved.
yeah. I would have to think it probably had to have something to do with the skill of the teletype, uh, the telegraph. Uh, and that was a big port in Rome. So maybe they just needed, teletype
They
operators
needed
there,
people.
telegraph operators there.
Yeah.
Um, and I
Yeah.
keep saying teletype because when I first started working at a bank, I worked at the wire transfer department. We had teletype
Oh
machines all over
yes.
the place.
Yes. 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 I just had a conversation with one of my nieces and had to explain in the old banks how they had the pneumatic tubes that would allow you to
Yes,
pass
yes, yes.
mail from
Yeah,
various places, and she thought I was making it up, you know. Um,
well,
so
I'm almost finished with. In fact, I'm pretty much finished with. I'm just editing and adding some photos, but uh, the book I'm writing now is about my career in banking,
mhm,
and that's the part of we had the pneumatic tubes,
mhm.
and we used to send the cables. The once they were printed on paper, we had these conveyor belts with different colors in them.
Huh.
So it would be like maybe it was like 6 to 8 slots with
Mhm.
different color, um, plastic or whatever to denote each one.
Mhm.
And depending on where you drop that paper, it would go down the conveyor belt and drop down the slot for the next
Uh-huh.
person to look at it or send it or do the test on it or things like that.
These are the things that our future generations will look back on, and when they're doing their research, they'll wonder, how did they ever do that, or how did that work? It's so antiquated.
Um,
So yeah.
well, yeah, and the tubes are funny because um, if you had to drop it the bottom first. If
Hmm.
you dropped it the
Yes.
other way around, they would get stuck. Sometimes they would open up and all the cables would get lost and all of that kind of stuff. And then
Hmm.
you'd have the cursing tube maintenance guy come up screaming at
Yes.
everybody how stupid they were for doing
Yes.
it.
Yes. It's crazy how things have changed. Yes.
And it wasn't that long ago. It was a
No,
long
no.
time ago,
Well,
but it
we
wasn't
don't think it
that
was
long
that
ago.
long ago. We don't think it was that long ago.
I I used to sit there with the adding machine.
Yes. Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
yeah, completely different world. I said to somebody the other day, I think if we put a rotary phone in front of some of the kids, they wouldn't know what to do with it.
Yes. Yes. And that was even one of the things when we were in going to the house in Brooklyn that I was telling you about. The rotary phones, because the phone was so old, it had the original phone number on it, which was only like 4 digits, but they
Yeah,
weren't really digits. It was like, you know, uh, Beekwood 45709 or whatever it was, where it was more of a name than anything else. Um, I remember that phone wasn't changed from the time they built that house until the time they sold that house. It was this
my
big black monstrosity.
yeah,
So,
my mother had the same phones. We had the wall phones, one upstairs and one
mhm, mhm,
downstairs. Um, and like you said, the number was Independence IN34791.
mhm,
Uh,
mhm,
and
exactly.
and you could only walk as far as the cord took you.
Yes, 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 exactly, exactly.
You had to stop
Um,
halfway across the room.
yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting how fast that kind of thing changes, And now I see my mother, who's a grandmother in her own right, who got a smartphone once she had grandchildren that were old enough to text, and she learned how to text because her grandchildren were texting. So, it's interesting how far everybody has come. But
Yeah,
yeah.
and I remember the World's Fair. That was where we first
Hmm.
had the push button on
Oh,
the phone.
really?
Yes.
Really? My parents went to that. I have pictures of them
Yeah.
um, at the World's
Let's see,
Fair.
I was 13 when the
Mm,
World's Fair.
yeah.
And that was the big thing. You went to the AT&T, I guess, pavilion, and they had the
Hmm.
push button phones and you could call. And then they also had around the first conference type things. They had these little egg-shaped things.
Oh.
And you could go in there with the family and call somebody from
Oh.
the
Oh, I
thing and
see.
everybody be on speaker.
Everybody be on speaker.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, now the only reason that I go past it is, now we call it City Field. It used to be Shea Stadium.
Mhm.
'Cause my mother is still out on Long Island, because all of my mother's generation, well, my grandmother's generation all stayed in Brooklyn. My mother's generation, her and all her cousins moved out east to Long Island. So we would make the trips back and forth to Brooklyn for the holidays, and we would always pass the World's Fair. Um, the big globe
Hmm.
and the two things that look like spaceships.
Yeah, yeah.
Those two towers. And
Well,
also when we went to Shay.
mom's mother and my aunt and uncles, we could walk from those. That's the New York State Pavilion, those two tower like
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
That was like, I don't know, 5 or 6 blocks from my grandmother's house.
Oh, so you were close.
Yeah, and we
Yeah,
used to be able to walk to the World's Fair from there.
yeah.
Those couple of summers, if my mother was at my grandmother's house, we would just walk to the World's Fair. I never had to pay for the World's Fair because my dad worked for the Daily News,
Oh,
and so I never paid for Shea Stadium or the World's Fair
oh,
growing up.
nice. Very
So it was free.
nice. You know, we um baseball was big in my family. Baseball, well, it still is, but it was always big in my family. And we would go to several games a year and get like the nosebleed seats because we were paying for them. Um, in fact, talk about an Italian family going to opening day at Shea Stadium. My we would get there would be like at least 30 of us. We would fill up like two full rows. And this is before all of the security and the rules were in place, so where you couldn't bring in food.
Mhm.
And um we would first of all, my sister and I would get off of school if opening day was during the week. That was, as far as my family was concerned, that was a holiday. You got off from school. um my mother would get up in the morning and start cooking, and she'd cook sausage and eggs, and she'd cook peppers and eggs and make all of these sandwiches. And we would go to the ballpark, and who brought the coffee, who brought the pastries, we would have all the sandwiches. I mean, they would literally bring an entire feast of food that we would eat while we were watching the baseball game. We'd give it to people around us, would have food. And uh, it wasn't tailgating so much because we weren't in the parking lot, but we would literally just sit and with all of this food and watch the ball game and yell at the ball players and the umpires. And um, it's one of my best childhood memories
That's
because
fantastic. Yeah.
it was every year like clockwork. Opening day, we would be there. you know um and I think one of the big heartaches for my parents, especially my father, is that I was raised a Mets fan, but I married a Yankee fan.
Oh boy.
So I know it's like marrying out of your religion. It was it was a big deal. you know um but it was amazing, and it's something that like our kids will never get because you can't do that kind of thing anymore.
No,
Between the
no.
prices of the tickets, plus they regulate what you're allowed to bring in, um it's uh it's not like it used to be you
No,
know
well, to your point, we used to go to the beach. My mom and my cousin's aunt, I mean, she was like an aunt to us, of course, but
yeah.
they drove. They both had licenses and they would drive. And so I guess when we would, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, whatever, we would go to Jones Beach.
Hmm.
And the same thing, we'd be eating eggplant parmesan and sausage and
Yes.
peppers, and the white kids were eating peanut butter and jelly and
Yes.
bologna.
Yes, exactly, exactly. It they knew how to cook and they knew how to pack. And even some of the pictures I have of my family in the 30s was them driving out to Long Island from
Mhm.
Brooklyn, and they'd have these huge picnics. And you'd see like these picnic tables just full of food. And they would take everything with them. And, some of it would be them cooking, barbecuing there, but a lot of it was just prep the food at home and just bring it with you. There was none of this stopping at McDonald's and getting a hamburger.
No, no. Thankfully, we didn't grow up on that. And
Yes, no, we
my
didn't either.
grandmother's block for many years until they stopped it. They they one of the feasts was right outside my grandmother's house,
Oh,
and
so it was like a block party.
yeah, so
Yeah.
every summer, and it was always around my grandmother's birthday in August.
Hmm.
So every summer we had that, and back then the Zeppelo stand was right in front of my grandmother's
Oh.
house, and it
Hmm.
was three for a quarter.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that's gone. That's
Yeah,
gone.
yeah.
Uh,
Um, we went to I went to San Gennaro in the city, the San Gennaro festival a few years ago, and it's completely changed.
it's not
It's
the
not the
same.
same at all,
No, it's
you
horrible.
know.
And so
So,
we went, I guess it was maybe 5 years ago or something like that.
mhm,
Uh, and there were no Italians. There was
yeah,
nobody in the stands, or, nobody cooking
yeah,
the food or anything at the time. I mean, maybe there were one or two.
yeah.
Um, but I remember going there probably when I was in my 20s, and my cousin Mike he was traveling the feast by the food stands.
Oh,
So
yes.
he would go
Hmm.
from the pizza to the sausage and pepper to the Zeppela
Yes.
back to the pecans.
Mhm. Mhm. Definitely, definitely. Well, the food, I mean, I think in a way the best part of being Italian is the food.
Of course, yeah.
It's just I every like once or twice a year my great aunts would make the macaroni from scratch.
Mm,
And we'd come in again, we would go into Brooklyn because this was the thing, and she'd have she'd make fettuccine for the most part, and she'd have the strips laying across the dining room table drying, and it was almost like a tablecloth, because it was just all of these strips of macaroni, and it was macaroni, it wasn't pasta.
right. Yeah, there's no pasta.
So there was
There's
no
no pasta
pasta.
back.
And when we would come in, she would cut them down to manageable stripes, and then she would cook them. And it was always, she didn't do it every week, but a couple of times a year she would do it, and the entire family would come in from, various places just to eat this. And it was so good. There was nothing like it.
Well, my uncle he used to make the ravioli every Easter.
Hmm.
And the same, the big board with the dowel and roll it all out.
Yes. Yes.
And I actually, the last time I made pasta, I didn't use the machine. I got a good rolling pin and I tried it that way. And I
Hmm.
couldn't roll it out like him. I had to do it in section. I mean, he would roll out this
Yeah.
big giant sheet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but he used to put them on the sofa to dry. They put sheets on the sofa,
Huh.
and put the
Okay.
ravioli on there to dry out,
Hmm.
for a couple hours. And one year, my cousin Frank sat in the ravioli, and I wrote a song about that eventually.
That's funny.
But
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't miss it. It was all laid out
Yeah,
there.
I was gonna say, wow. Yeah, my
Um,
my mother would describe how her grandmother, my great grandmother, would make the orchetti, and she would
oh
just sit
yeah.
with this big
Mhm.
bowl of dough, and I don't know if you could see, but
Yep.
she just used her thumb, and she would
Yep.
just like do like this, and apparently she was quite fast, and and they would eat it all the time, and that's one of like her memories that she would tell me. um but yeah, it's I think part of it is that we're all working, we don't have the time to cook like that every day. And it's just, even getting the ingredients is hard. Now you have to go to a special, we I have to drive 20 minutes to go to and to get to a good Italian deli and get some decent food. When we
Um,
first moved to Long Island, my grandmother, who still lived in Brooklyn, and my grandfather would come out every other week and would bring groceries from Brooklyn, because there was no way to get groceries on the island. And they would bring sausage and mozzarella, and they'd bring all the cold cuts and the bread and the pork, the brajol, all of this stuff. And the day that they showed up, we would eat like kings. Lunch that day was just incredible, because they brought everything out to us.
yeah.
You know,
Levati's, that's the name. Levati's.
Levadis.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Uh, so there's one in Freehold and one in Middletown. We lived in
Okay.
Middletown for a while, so
Huh.
they're both about the same distance, but they have really really good stuff. Anybody in Jersey, looking for an
Yeah.
Italian place, try Levati's. But we we have an Italian bakery walking distance in Bradley
Oh,
Beach. So,
oh, that's
and
nice.
it's a real Brooklyn style,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
bakery, and great stuff. To pretty much everything. They have everything there. So it's really fantastic to have that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and to be able to walk there is even
Yes.
better.
Yes. Yes, that is definitely a plus. We're all the way up in northern Jersey, and we just bought a house about a year ago. So we're still getting the lay of the land as far as the best places to shop. You know, we moved from a pretty Italian town, Lyndhurst, which had a lot of nice places, but now we're up a little further and still exploring where it is we need to go. So but we'll get there. Yeah.
Well, Natalie, this has been great fun. I really appreciate
Yes,
you
it
taking the time.
has. It
I
has.
could go on for another 4 hours, but
I know, you and me
that would
both.
bore everybody to death.